Greetings everyone, and welcome to the Prop Shop. I am Eric, and today I am finally bringing to you my making of for the Star Wars A New Hope on Earth in the 1880s video. Thank you so much for your patience. I know this baby took a real long time. I didn't want it to take this long.
I didn't want it to take this long. Oh, it took so long.
Anyways, it is finished for you, and I tried to be as in-depth as I could. I know I still probably missed some things, so feel free to comment if you have any questions. I'll try to answer them, alright? I have time-stamped this, that way you can jump to whatever aspect interests you. If none of it interests you, then, you know, what are you doing here? Go watch a grizzly bear punch a dolphin, or a monkey, whatever you watch. If you are interested in the Star Wars 1880s idea, it is expanding. I'm making a full trailer for A New Hope. Do stay tuned for the end of this video, as I will be telling you what's coming up next. It's very exciting. With that being said, let's get into it. I was assigned this scene through Crowdsourced Boston. It is run by Brookline Interactive Media Group, or BIG. Crowdsourced Boston, in conjunction with Northampton and Vermont Media Centers, each organize their crowdsourcing project each year. It has been going on for 8 years total. Boston has been involved for the last 6, and I have contributed to all of those projects. How it works: they announce an iconic film from the past, give teams time to sign up for one or multiple scenes. The scene or scenes are then assigned. You have around 3 months to complete them. Composers also create original music. The crowdsource editor then assembles the entire film. Crowdsourced Boston caps off the project with a public screening in the historic Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's a fun time and a great way to meet other filmmakers in the area. I wanted to honor the films of Akira Kurosawa. I had recently watched a lot of his classic samurai films when Crowdsourced announced A New Hope as their film for 2022. George Lucas was a big fan of Kurosawa. C-3PO, R2-D2, and Princess Leia were all inspired by his film The Hidden Fortress. Ralph McQuarrie heavily used samurai aesthetic in his design of Darth Vader, especially in the helmet design. I knew that Bandai had samurai-inspired Star Wars action figures, so I knew I could mix those miniatures with live-action footage. This would put my scene somewhere after The Last of the Samurai, sometime post-1870s. I figured Vader would have been the last samurai and had betrayed his own kind like he did with the Jedi. In this alternate reality, he and his army would join with the British Empire. Now, I chose the British Empire simply because they had a global presence at the time. Lucas also used many British actors as Imperials in the movies, and you have to admit, those red uniforms really pop. This would also be after the U.S. Civil War. It seemed appropriate to make Han Solo a former Union soldier who somehow got his hands on an ironclad ship. Solo, after all, mimicked the classic gunslinger from classic Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns. Leone also took heavy inspiration from Kurosawa, so much so that it resulted in a lawsuit over fistful of dollars being an unofficial remake of Yojimbo. On to the miniatures. Here is the Darth Vader figure. Some of you may wonder why I added antlers. I found that the Maidate, or the imperial symbol on his forehead, seemed a little large for the size of the kabuto, or helmet. I knew I wanted something on top, and knew that there were plenty of historical examples of antlers. After a search on Amazon, I found this reindeer that seemed to be in scale with the Vader figure, and had somewhat symmetrical antlers. Once I got it, I chopped them off and drilled tiny holes in both the antlers and helmet and used a small gauge wire to reinforce a superglue bond. The wire turned out to be key, as the glue would not have been strong enough on its own. Here you can see a comparison of the antlers in their original color along with shots of the final painted look. For filming, I used needle nose pliers to grab the back of the helmet. This way I could create the illusion of the figure turning its head. Here you can see the green screen shoot, with me attempting to match the figure's movements with that of Vader in the film. For all these figures, I ended up shooting in the standard 24 frames a second as opposed to a higher frame rate that is traditional with miniatures. I hadn't experimented much with slow motion, so I wanted to avoid that learning curve as the deadline for finishing this project was looming. I did find that the warp stabilizer tool in Premiere Pro helped smooth out the jittery movements of the toy footage. This is traditionally used for shaky footage, and oh boy, did it really save my butt here. On to the Stormtrooper figure. I didn't end up having to do anything to this figure. The only thing I did was remove the sword, as the Stormtroopers in the film used guns, and the 1880s was, of course, an age of the gun. Samurai did historically use firearms, so this was not a stretch. The figure does have a flintlock that would be out of date in the 1880s, but I decided it was a small detail and left it as is. Also, I did not sculpt the armor nipples, so don't blame me! For the sake of filming, I had a lot of shots where I could get away with static plates that I created in Photoshop. I did photo shoots of the Stormtrooper figures, then I cut the figure out in Photoshop, accentuated the light source. As the setting began to take shape in my mind, I could then drop these stills into the backdrop, creating a small army that was part of its surrounding. The filming of the Stormtroopers was just like that of the Vader filming. I tried to mimic the movements of the original shots as much as I could so that I would have less work to do in post. That being said, I still had a lot of adjusting of position and scale of the figures in Premiere Pro to have them match the Photoshop background. This could be as minute as a frame-by-frame adjustment, very time-consuming. I also duplicated the figures in these shots so that I could create shadows. I just made the figure black and dropped down the opacity, and then set it in front of the figure itself, creating the illusion. The third figure I used was this archer. I know archers seemed a little out of place in this time frame, but there were samurai archers up till the 1870s, and it looks too cool not to use. Ultimately, I only used this figure for one shot with its back away from the camera. I shot it at different angles with different lighting so that I could fit it into the scene as 4 separate troopers. Time for the Ironclad Millennium Falcon! I am very pleased with how this came out. This model is 100% custom built and comprised mostly of foam core, poster board, and cardboard. Here you can see the underside and just how simple and crude it is. I maybe spent $30 on supplies. Elmer's glue and Super 77 spray adhesive were my best friend on this project. I started with sketches as I tried to figure out how I was going to transform the classic Falcon into something more earthly and Victorian. I knew I wanted to make it an ironclad. Those ships are so specific to this era, and a great snapshot in a time when naval ships were transitioning from classic wood to modern steel. The front wedges of the Falcon screamed catamaran to me. 2 hulls connected together to support the weight of the iron cladding of the top level. The center has a rotating turret housing back-to-back cannons for the scene when Luke and Han take out the TIE fighters. Once I had the look established, I began building up the foundation in foam core. This is better quality foam core from an artist's supply store as opposed to the softer dollar store version. I used any and every cheap material I had on hand. To create individual panels, I drew them out with a pen, used an X-Acto blade and cut along the lines, and then pushed the tip of the pen into the foam core about 1/8 of an inch and pulled along the lines. This gave each line some depth and width and created the look of individual panels. For the front section of the hulls, I used standard cardboard. I did not have time to make balsa wood planks, so this was a quick way to get some linear detail. I simply peeled the top off of a piece of cardboard. Here you can see the foundation finished. I almost forgot to take this picture before I painted the entire model in a flat black base coat. I then painted it with a flat gray and began adding dressmaker straight pins as rivets and railing. Here you can see I added the surface greeblies. I also applied some acrylic paint for rust effects. Now once I got to this step, I kind of wondered if I was finished, but it seemed like I was missing something, so I went back to the research. I really responded to the mix of metal and wood that was so unique to the ironclads of this era, so I went ahead and repainted the front cardboard section with a wood finish. Here you can see that change. I also created ropes using light khaki embroidery thread. Now this is kind of like a thick thread or a really thin yarn. I applied a warm brown wash to give that thread some aging. Here you can see the streaking and other aging I painted in. I also painted some panels red and various colors of gray to match the original Falcon paint scheme. This image was a crude test to see how the model would look with strong backlighting. At this point, I had burnished the surface panels. This gave them a smooth, reflective surface as opposed to the flat textured look left by the spray paint. I think I used either paper or a cloth to burnish. Honestly, I can't remember. The important thing is that it ended up being crucial, and it really helped to make the cladded sections look like metal. Here you can see a detailed shot of the planks being added. This was the same poster board I used on the sides of the ship and turret siding. I used spray adhesive to attach them. For the railing, I wrapped gray thread around those straight pins that I used as posts. This was done before spray painting so that the paint would bind everything and add some heft to the thread. You can also see that each rivet was individually painted to help them stand out. It's very tedious, but an important detail. I just used some screws and nuts for the circular cutouts in the front. The other greeblies are random bits I found at the bottom of an old screw container. This felt very in the spirit of the original Star Wars and the early days of ILM. The ladders were specially bought from the architecture section of an artist supply store. Here you can see the rotating turret. I still do need to insert cannons. I didn't bother finishing the backside as it would not be seen. To create the exhaust vents, I painted soda bottle caps and topped them with granny grating. I cut out this door and added some rivets around it. Here you can see a strip of poster board peeling away. Here's a clear shot of all the straight pins that are in this model. It's rather terrifying. This ship should be called the Iron Maiden. Here are the stills that I used for the final shots. I tied the embroidery thread around black thumbtacks and stuck them into a large piece of foam core. Easy peasy. As much as I like this model in broad daylight, it looks so much better with dramatic lighting. Finally, I built the ramp in two sizes. They're both comprised of a painted balsa wood base, a wire frame, and material as side covering. For the small ramp, I had some tiny gauge wire that looked in scale, but was still strong enough to hold its structure. I hot glued it to the bottom of the balsa plank and cut up brown paper towel for the siding. It's kind of ridiculous, but hey, it worked. The large ramp was only partial, as I cut every corner I could to save time. This one had cut up wire hangers as the frame, so it was much sturdier. For the siding, I used a cotton muslin. I tacked a couple spots to keep the muslin in place on the wire framing. And that's that. Now on to Tarkin's office miniature. Here you can see the sidewall section containing the mural. I wanted to bring a lot of Japanese visual aesthetics for this version of the Death Star. I figured Tarkin's office would be decked out with cool murals. Here's an early experiment I did in Photoshop as I was trying to decide on the look. And here's a work in progress on the final mural on top, along with the more polished version below. Due to time constraints, I am guilty of collaging existing artwork to create this mural. Here are the artworks individually with credits, as I don't want to be like creepy AI and steal indiscriminately. I wanted to convey the idea that this is a giant floating island fortress. The waves would separate it from the trees on each side. Here's a shot of the entire panel with the paper windows and wood framing. I composited various visual elements in Photoshop. I then printed them, cut them out, and adhered them to foam core using Super 77 spray adhesive. Here you can see that almost everything was flat paper with the exception of some painted balsa wood framing. I used the balsa wood to create some dimension. I knew when the light was hitting it, it would create shadows and just make the piece much more interesting and believable. To achieve that look, I sprayed balsa strips black and then sanded the living hell out of them. It was a lot more of a workout than I expected, but the grain on the balsa matched the Photoshop wood, so, it was definitely worth it. Here's the door frame and sliding doors. These are separate pieces. The doors have printed images that wrapped around them so that they have dimension. The door frame was created the same way as the mural, with a mix of printed imagery and balsa framing. I skipped the balsa for the hallway section as it was not going to be featured as prominently. I did cut out the window sections, however, and then attached printed window elements to the back so light could shine through them appropriately. The floor was hardwood floor images printed out multiple times and laid like tile on a large piece of foam core, once again using the spray adhesive. Here you can see a corner starting to come up. And here are a couple photos of the set being shot. I ended up taking still images at various angles for the different shots that were required. There was really no need to film as they were all static shots. I did intend to film the doors opening and closing, but I did not have extra hands to accomplish this. I also knew that the model would shake too much as we tried to move the doors. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to create this digitally, and I did that with a combination of Photoshop and then Premiere Pro. On to casting. When it came time to shoot the live-action elements, I did not have enough time to do auditions. I cast friends that I knew that I could count on, as I did not have an actor budget. Thus, you get Brits that don't really have accents, but have the look. If I were really doing this as a production, Obi-Wan would have been Japanese, and Luke and Leia maybe would have been like half Japanese, thinking that Anakin would have had a secret relationship with a woman from Europe or America. That would have added pressure to his life and helped add to his downfall. For many of the uniformed Brits, I used my friend and roommate John Manson. He actually turned me on to Crowdsourced Boston and has helped me either in front of or behind the camera on every project since. He's always down to give a hand in whatever capacity. He's a great collaborator and has a leading man look. Let's have a look at how many times John pops up in this project. My friend John Anthony stepped in as Tarkin. He's a molecular biologist by day and film buff by night. John is a walking encyclopedia of film history from the silent era up to contemporary foreign and domestic films. This love of cinema has made him another great collaborator on multiple projects. He will do anything from holding a light, to playing a Kramer-esque game warden, to starring as an evil Grand Moff. Rich Faymanville rounds out the Brits. I met Rich through my roommate, as they have been lifelong friends. Rich has punched up scripts in the past and is currently a voice actor for audiobooks. He has also helped on past crowdsourced projects. I was able to use his voice talent here to deliver a solid British accent. My lovely girlfriend, Lily Travis, stepped in at the 11th hour to play Luke. She's a head pharmacist and fashionista. I decided to give her a Dolores from Westworld vibe, as this would fit the era. I got called woke because I had a female Luke, which I got a kick out of. That being said, I'm already broke, so might as well go woke. Jean-Michel Campin was nice enough to play my Obi-Wan. He's an oceanographer and occasional bartender hailing from France. His epic beard and genuine accent gave this project an extra dimension as the monk-like mentor. Rounding out the cast is myself as Han Solo. I'm certainly not cool enough to be Han, but I'm the director, so I'll do what I want. On a more practical level, casting myself meant one less actor I had to worry about. I also knew the costume would fit. The logistics are a lot easier if you can be in your own project. I almost forgot that the pug hand puppet was played by John Anthony, our Tarkin. I wanted to talk really quickly about the gear I used. I shot this on the Sony A7 III. You can see my rig here. Most everything is from small rig aside from the cage and the old Feel World monitor. I used the Sony FE 35mm 1.8 for Tarkin and the Falcon crew. This is not the G Master, but the more affordable full-frame prime lens. I used the Tamron 24mm f2.8 half macro lens for most of the soldier shots, as well as all the action figure shots. It has a minimum focusing distance of 4.7 inches, making it a great lens for miniatures, especially considering it's under $200 US. I also use the C-Tech 15-inch quad broadcast monitor. It helps to ensure that I'm in focus. For lighting, I use two Pixel C100s as well as a GVM 300-watt Cobb light with 24-inch softboxes from Neewer. I also used a couple old LED panels to throw warm backlight onto the actors. This helped to separate them from the green screen. I captured audio with a Deity VMic D3 Pro plugged into an old Zoom H4n. I like the Deity so much I just got another one. They work great as long as you position them correctly. On to the live action filming. I was able to get everything done in just 2 days. I shot the group on the Falcon, followed by the Tarkin bits in one afternoon. Then I shot John and Rich as well as the action figures on a separate day. I had a tablet on set so we could watch the shots we were recreating. That way the actors could get a sense of the blocking and pacing. I would say any lines that were off camera to help with timing as needed. I would later adjust the footage, key out the green screen, and add the appropriate background and old film look in Premiere Pro. Here you can see a comparison of my version with the original. Some shots were easier to frame than others. This wide shot was the trickiest as I barely had enough space and green material to make the shot work. In fact, I later had to adjust John's exposure as he walked towards one of the lights. So many little challenges pop up on these types of projects, you just never know till you get into it. For the Falcon crew, I used a combination of foam core and folding tables. I arranged 4 folding tables creating an O shape. I covered them in black cloth. I then placed 2 large foam core sheets onto the tables. Each sheet had a large rectangular section cut out. I made sure the tables were set in a couple inches so that I could lay these rectangular pieces inside their respective frames and onto the table's edges, so they wouldn't fall on the floor. This also ensured we could sit on the foam core edges and not break them as they were completely resting on the tables. It was as low-tech as possible, and aside from having to do some masking in post, it worked like a charm. We did around 6 takes, I believe, before I felt comfortable that I had the coverage. I'm blessed by being able to shoot these projects where I work. It's a large building, and with a little coordination, I can find a place to shoot that isn't being used on any given weekend. I was able to use our warehouse for the other shoot day. This gave me a ton of space. John's infantry shots were all pretty quick to shoot. I just had to make sure I had enough footage of him being still on either side of a movement, especially when he was standing guard at the doors. His speaking role was more challenging as I had to pull focus. And then the other shot when he's walking, I just tried to get as much footage of him walking as I could. The shots of Rich were also very straightforward. I did have to make sure I gave him proper lighting when his character was on the dock. Carrying consistent lighting throughout each aspect of this process was a fun challenge. You will hear some of his audio is a little off. I think I mistakenly did not have the microphone in the right place when I did the over-the-shoulder shot of him. Lesson learned. On to costumes. I should say that I am a professional costumer. I went to grad school for costume design, so this is always an important aspect for every project I create. My job also gives me unique access to a costume stock. This certainly helped me on this project. That being said, there are always tweaks that need to be made. Here is the jacket that was used for Tarkin and the officer at the beginning of the scene. I did end up having to add the gold trim around the collar. I also wanted to add the white trim to the center front. I stitched the underside on a machine, then folded it over and sewed the inside by hand. I bought these Imperial collar lapels and used them as officer insignia. They were originally silver, so I hit them with a gold metallic Sharpie I had on hand. Here's another look at that gold trim I added. I did double the width on the collar. I also added a single band along the cuff. I also added gold braided epaulets. I found that safety pins can be a fast and dirty way to attach them if you don't have the time or desire to do something more permanent. These safety pins secured an understrap that's attached to the epaulets on the underside at each end. Here is the infantry uniform I used. I attempted to have a somewhat accurate representation of the 24th of Foot Regiment. The jacket, however, is most definitely a costume and not an accurate reproduction. The buttons are generic, as are the cuff and collar details. That being said, the material and craftsmanship are quite good, as it was made by professionals many years ago. Here's the backside of the uniform. This is the M1871 Field Equipment. This is the bread bag that would be appropriate for this kit. This is an accoutrement pouch, bayonet frog, a shot of the adjustable strappings. Here you can see the 24th of Foot belt buckle. This style of buckle is still used on the more ceremonial uniform belts, such as the Queen's Guard, or rather King's Guard. The inside reveals the buff color that the set arrived in. I had this sitting around unpainted for maybe a decade. This gave me a reason to finally paint it. I just used simple white acrylic. It helped smooth the raw finish. Here's one of the two cartridge box pouches. The P1871 wooden water bottle with screw-off top. And, of course, the pith helmet. Here's a shot of the inside of this replica. The badge came from a costume bobby hat, I believe. I painted the original pewter gold. It is great in that it has flexibility, and thus the ability to form to the curve of the helmet. I bought all of these accessories from IMA, International Military Antiques. It looks like they don't have anything in stock at the moment of filming this video, but just enter Zulu War replica uniform in a search and you'll be on your way. On to the Han Solo costume. It is a mishmash of items. The vest is a reproduction Civil War era Union Army vest made of wool. The shirt is just a wingtip pleated front tuck shirt. The vest was originally too long and hid the gun belt, so I tacked it up about 5 inches at the front. Here you can see it tacked on the side as well. The pants are from the modern U.S. Army dress blue uniform. This style is inspired by Civil War Union uniforms, so it works. And it's much more comfortable than replica wool trousers. Here's the slouch cap, possibly from Ruby's costume company many years ago. I added the cord to keep with the cavalry look. Now here is a great and affordable cheat when you don't have tall riding boots. Boot tops. They fit over a black shoe and give the illusion of a tall boot. The elastic of the bottom keeps it snug to the shoe. Works the same as a gaiter or spatterdasher. Last is the Western gun belt and holster set. And the revolver, which is decent for a costume grade prop. It's certainly smaller than the real thing, but it serves its purpose. I will now talk about assembling the visual elements. I did use Premiere Pro for the edit. Here you can see my timeline. The top portion contains all the visual elements. The blue is video footage, and the pink are stills. You can see just how many separate pieces make up any given shot, 5 being the minimum and 21 being the max. This was quite a strain on my old computer, so I had to render out the footage at certain points. This would flatten the footage, allowing me to then add more complicated effects, such as shadows and reflections. I also had to do this before adding the old film look. The bottom half of the timeline is the audio, which I will talk about after this. I will start by showing this shot. It contains several separate elements, making it a good candidate for this breakdown. We have live action at the front, action figures behind that, then a mixture of miniature still shots and a little Photoshop magic to give us the environment. Here's the original footage of the actors. In Premiere, I had to mask out parts of the background that would compromise the green screen keying. I also had to adjust their movement and scale to create the illusion that they were walking up a ramp. Here you can see they only had a couple crude steps to work with on set. I had them mimic walking and prayed that it would somehow work in post. When I managed to make the shot work, I was extremely happy, and very relieved. Here are the action figures I talked about earlier in this video. I divided up a single shot, making one stormtrooper look like two. I had to do a lot of tweaking to make them the correct scale. Here you can also see me applying the warp stabilizer tool to smooth out their motion. This shot of the other trooper shows the warp stabilizer in action. The background consists of a miniature ramp broken up into two separate layers, followed by a still of the Falcon model. I used Photoshop to add extra rivets onto the Falcon, as well as the ground seen on the bottom right and the stone wall on the top right. Here are all the elements coming together to create the final shot. You can also see the old film filter being added. Here you can see the illusion of them walking up the ramp. I also added Rich's shadow. So many details. Here's a simpler shot being put together, the original compared to my footage. I used the Ultra Key tool in Premiere Pro to remove all the green screen video elements. Then I placed a still of my office miniature behind the actor. These shots were easy peasy. This shot of the officer entering Tarkin's office presented a real challenge. Here you can see the still of my office miniature set. I broke it up into separate layers in Premiere. The office interior was the top layer, with each individual door being added as PNG files behind that. I then added the two guards, the officer, Vader figure, table reflections, and Tarkin. The reflections on the table were created by duplicating a flattened version of the footage. I then flipped that vertically and blurred it appropriately. Here's the final shot with the old film filter. This office shot was one of the most difficult as I did not have the space to easily pull it off. Here are the green screen elements of my actors. This footage was captured on different days in different locations. Here is the shot I used of my miniature set. Here's the adjusted shot with all the elements being added. The window reflection was achieved like I did with the previous shot. I did, however, have to animate John's shadow as he walked in front of the light source. This shot of the Falcon was one of the first I started working on. It took me many iterations to get this environment. It's mostly comprised of several Photoshop layers. Each layer is a combination of multiple images being manipulated to fit together. It's a very long process with many wrong turns along the way. Once I had this setting established, I could add a still of the Falcon model along with proper shadows. I also shot different angles of my Stormtrooper figure from a bird's eye view. I added shadows in Photoshop so the troopers would fit into the scene seamlessly. The bird graphics were found on YouTube as free green screen elements. This was the same for the smoke I added in the foreground. Here's the compiled shot once again, along with the final old film version. This shot presented several challenges that I knew I couldn't quite overcome. I would need to simplify the shot to have any prayer of pulling it off. Once again, I created the background in Photoshop. I used the actual gate at the Imperial Palace for my structure. This was another case of collaging and manipulating several images in Photoshop just to get this one angle with the proper lighting and shadows. For the troops, I used two different stills of the Stormtrooper figure. I adjusted the highlights and shadows in Photoshop and then shrunk it down and layered them until I had a large block of troops. Next came a still of the Falcon model, some archers, then shadowing. Then I established the high contrast scene in the final shot. I knew I couldn't pull off troops running in the midground, so I opted to have them walk in front of the camera. This was a compromise I could live with. The troops were green screen elements. I keyed out the green screen, adjusted their motion, and duplicated them. I offset the duplicated layer, as well as changed the scale and height to pull off the illusion. I added some crates as well as the same troop stills used earlier, only flipped. I took a still of Rich and made it look like it was walking down the ramp. I then added a duplicate layer of the ramp and masked it off. I had the still of Rich disappear behind the troops. This allowed me to then add green screen footage of Rich stepping forward. I decided to have Vader enter from the other side, as it would be a lot easier to pull off. Here is the green screen footage. I simulated his walk while I filmed the figure, but still had to adjust the motion and scale to have him match the background. The shadow is a duplicate layer of Vader that was darkened, made transparent, flipped and skewed to match the angle of the other shadows in the shot. I did have to adjust the shadow's motion so it lined up with the Vader figure. It's very tedious work. Finally, I added a masked layer of the archers on top of the Vader layers to create the illusion of him walking behind them. These little details really sell the shot. Here's the compiled shot, followed by the final old film version. The final shot I'll talk about is the Falcon gang emerging from the secret compartment. I talked about the setup for this shot in the live-action portion of this video. Here you can see my alternate version of the Falcon interior. I used Photoshop to add wood grain and barrels. I also removed any wiring that made it look futuristic. And here you can see the original green screen shoot with the keying, masking layers, and old film filters fading in and out. You can also see John, my Tarkin actor, puppeteering the pug. The last aspect I will talk about is sound. I will keep this very brief. The sound consisted of audio captured on and offset, my Foley work mimicking armor clanking and footsteps, other sounds, such as birds, that I had to source, and finally, music. Nearly all audio and sound that I recorded was done so with a Deity vMic D3 Pro running through a Zoom H4n recorder. This was used for all actor dialogue. I also recorded my voice for off-camera diegetic sound, such as the voice on the phone or officers yelling orders on the dock. The Foley work ended up rather extensive, as all the Stormtrooper sound effects had to be created. Funny enough, I did have access to Ruby's Supreme Edition Stormtrooper armor, so I literally used Stormtrooper armor to mimic Stormtrooper armor. There were quite a few footsteps that I had to capture and mix in, not just for the troopers, but also for Vader and for some of the actors. While this is a tedious step, it's also fun and rather magical. I did use a blue snowball mic in my editing space when I recorded my Vader and Stormtrooper voices. For anything I had to source, like the above-mentioned birds chirping or dock noises, I found free use audio on YouTube. Finally, some of you already know where the music came from. I used old Universal music from the 30s that was also featured in the classic Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers serials that inspired Lucas. I also used one brief cue from Buck Rogers in the 25th century when the Falcon first appears. And that's that. That wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching. Coming up next, what I'm going to shoot is the opening of A New Hope. That shot with the blockade runner being chased by the Star Destroyer, and that destroyer's just coming over the camera nice and slow. I just got a beefy new computer along with a Sony FX3. So you're going to see some real juicy 4K, 120 frames per second goodness. Oh, it's going to be so great. I can't wait. Can't wait. But first I do need to make those two models, get a tutorial together, and also show you that shot. For those of you who have waited for this video, thank you so much for your patience. I must say I do work 2 jobs, and I've had a rather busy personal life lately.
Lame excuses.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, do all the stuff that people do here in the YouTube world. And with that being said, a toots!